Hey, it's Matt from Black Coal Woodworking. Welcome back. Today I am making a potato masher, and I'm starting out with a log. I believe this is birch, and I'm using my roughing gouge. This is going to be an old-fashioned jumbo-sized potato masher for those who have large families or maybe you're making food for a crowd. Step one here, like usual, is to get this thing to round. I actually did try making one of these once. The design was definitely not what I wanted. In fact, it did resemble something that should never be in a kitchen. And I will show that design near the end, actually. I do feel bad for the person that has it, but, well, it still mashes potatoes. Let's go with that. In the roughing process, this part right here is the critical dimension, or this end. I need this at the max diameter. The rest of this piece is going to be cut down quite a bit further. You'll see how I get to that in a minute. I've switched over to the skew to make my cuts a lot smoother, and this being wet wood means I'm not doing any sanding. And that is a good thing in this case. The sanding just will not work. With the wood being so wet, it will load up the sandpaper in about half a second, and I will not get any sanding done. So at the end now, I need to cut a little ways in to account for the point that I've got stabbed into the end of that piece of wood. I'm also using a slicing cut to make sure the end of that piece of wood is extremely smooth, because like I said, sanding's not an option, but that slicing cut is sure amazing, the way I can have a nice flat piece of wood, and here's a better view of that. I kind of want the bottom here to have a slight arc to it, ever so slightly. That way when you hit the bottom of a pot, you actually get a tiny bit of a point, and you can roll around a little bit, but you can still get into the corners of a pot. Here's a bit of a cleanup cut. I need to taper down toward the center of the piece of wood. So this is kind of the start of that. So I've marked out my transition points, and there's really only two. And I'm using my beading and parting tool to try to cut down to the depth I need. And that is a difficult task, I tell you. I've probably skipped through most of the video I took on this just because it's quite difficult to get past the wood fibers. And here I did make an attempt to try to use my caliper to get at the size, but just with all that wood sticking out, I didn't quite feel it was a good move for me, so lots of stopping the lathe to check on this guy. This is the second transition point, which is really up now by the top of the handle. I made an attempt to use my skew to do some peeling cuts because it is so much fun, normally. Now, when your wood is this wet, there's just a whole other challenge here. That wood, there's a lot of slivers coming past my fingers. You can tell I'm kind of backing away from it. And at some point here, check that out. You could make a mop out of that. Time to switch tools. Back to the roughing gouge. This is still a good, efficient tool to get down to round. I've still got to try to get all those loose fibers out of the way, because once they get between the blade and the wood, it just stops any and all cutting. Now that I've got my handle roughed out, it's time to mark out where the top of the handle goes. So I'm using my beading and parting tool here again to kind of set my line. And I'm going to try very quickly to use my skew here. I think I can. And yeah, I managed to get it there, which is very nice if I don't have to switch tools too often. Plus I can give it a very nice clean finish here. I didn't go quite to the end because that's where I'm going to end up cutting it off. Now for the taper. The taper is a little bit like a half bead, which is kind of what I'm trying. Although again, this wood's pretty wet and there's a lot of wood to remove here. I end up getting kind of stuck there. So time to go to my old trick, the peeling cut. I can kind of peel a cut in the same arc that I would want to run the bead. And yes, I get all those wood fibers, but then actually cutting the half bead here works extremely well. Cleans it up really nice, and then I can take a more of a finishing pass and refine the shape just a little bit better, a little bit easier with all that bulk of wood out of the way. Time to clean up that transition point here. I've got another plan for this a little bit later on that involves a guitar string. I'm hesitating here because I know this next cut's the most dangerous one. Not for me, but for the piece. Anytime I try and do one last little cut that involves a half bead or something like that, sometimes I end up getting a catch. This time I was fortunate. Now to finish off the handle. I need to create a taper in both directions that cleans up the cut from that roughing gouge, because for some reason I cannot make a smooth cut with that to save the piece of wood. And I gotta find the right size that fits my hand. It's just so nice when the clean edges come together. So this handle is still a little bit on the large side. Time to take out a little more bulk in the center. I don't want to remove any bulk from the outer edges. I still want a lot of strength. Guess I'm hoping I cook these potatoes well enough. For the top of the handle, I need to cut away enough material that I won't have the pokes on the end there from the headstock there, the drive center. I'm using that slicing cut again to get a nice smooth finish. And now I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to put my other half bead or arc. So I want the top of the handle to have a nice round feel to it, so that when I push on it, it's nice and gentle on my hand and maybe more mashy for the potatoes. I ended up running another one of those big half beads here. To create the cove, I'm using a 1/2 inch spindle gouge, and not very well, as you'll see in a second. Yeah, that's because I think I hit the wood without the sharpened part. I went a little high on that side because I've got an asymmetric grind, and that wing is fairly short, so I think I just hit the wood with the blunt part of the tool. So it means I've got to aim a little better. When I first started doing spindle work, I always wondered where and how do you know to add a bead or a cove or whatever. And in this case, the cove here is meant for fingers to hang on to the end. And then there's a little bit of a bead that I'm going to end up making, because it seems like having a nice transition point, like whether it's a little flat spot or a little bead or a cove or whatever, is always kind of nice. It adds a little bit of flair and makes it maybe just a bit more fancy and more hand turned as opposed to just a straight connecting part. And it's honestly just a little more fun to do as a wood turner. So after I got my bead, you can kind of tell I need to blend the size of that transition now so that the left side of the bead and the right side of the bead have the same size. I kind of want the bead to look like it was glued over top and that wooden dowel kind of runs straight through or something like that. Cleaning up these edges was a bit of a challenge with that wet wood seeming to want to cling on all the time. Ah, got it. One more little cleanup here with that spindle gouge. That's better. Now for some of that wood burning. This is a guitar string, and this is wet wood. And wet wood is extremely hard to add lines to. You first have to magically dry the wood somehow, and then get it to light on fire. Kind of a physical near impossibility with this thing. Anyway, now that that's done, time to turn the end off. This is the part of the turning that's always a little challenging for me. My dismounts have traditionally been less than stellar, and this one is really no different. A little more dramatic than some, I'd say. So, I work myself up to it. I am doing the prep stage so I can actually add oil. And part of me has to remember that I don't actually want the dismount quite yet, even though sometimes it can happen. So I get as brave as I must, and I stop. Alright, let's talk about design. This design, to me, looks wonderful. The design that I had prior to this design is not so wonderful. In fact, I'll show you a picture of that here after this dismount. Yeah, not a great dismount. Knock the camera over. So anyway, this design flows. It's very nice. I think anyway. My old design that I tried to copy that did not turn out is this. Kind of looked like a toilet brush or maybe a plunger. Anyway, back to the much better design. Yeah. This one should work out well. Feels nice in the hand also. Thanks for watching.